welcome to another Brookings Mountain West lecture. I'm Bill Brown. Welcome on behalf of all my colleagues at Brookings Mountain West and the Brookings Institution. We have one more lecture this semester. It'll be on the 19th. We have a colleague of Darrell's coming out, Cliff Gaddy, who's a senior fellow in global economy and development. And we'll have another timely lecture on Russia and its oil capacity and use, slightly historical, but looking forward. And in light of geopolitical events, I think that'll be very interesting. Tonight, though, we have Darrell West here, who's a vice president of Brookings and director of the Governance Studies program, an expert on several things. You may have heard him on KNPR just a couple of weeks ago, talking about his new book. But tonight he's here to talk about the future of the internet in the wake of spam, cyberbullying, and Wikileaks. And Darrell has been thinking about, writing about, and researching this topic before most of us knew whatever those terms were. And I'll just he'll follow our usual procedure. He'll give a talk and then take some Q&A, so be ready to test him. I should add that he will not be available to fix your hard drives or reboot your systems, but you'll enjoy Darrell.
Fix my own hard drive, so I'm certainly not going to volunteer to fix anyone else's. But it's a pleasure to be here in Las Vegas. I appreciate you all coming out and braving those strong winds, but I do want you to know all the hot air has nothing to do with my arrival in the state of Nevada. This is my first visit to Las Vegas since 1978. So I admit it's been a while. A few things have changed in the last 33 years. The skyline looks a little different. There's a little more neon. The traffic is a little worse than what I recall, but that could be a reflection just of my fading memory. Who knows? But what I'd like to do today is talk about the future of the internet. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the internet. It is an outgrowth of this old Defense Department initiative called ARPANET. That was the 1969 precursor of the internet. ARPANET was a connection that linked 4 different scientific labs so that they could have inter-office communications, that people in those labs could send messages to one another, they could post research papers and share comments on each other's research. But it wasn't until 1991 that a computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee actually expanded this network to a national and international audience and therefore created the internet that we know of today. So for those of you who are wondering, it really wasn't Al Gore who invented the internet. But since then, we've seen the emergence of search engines, e-commerce sites, and social networking sites that have proven to be very popular. What I'd like to do today is cover 3 topics. First of all, talk about the internet innovations that are transforming our lives. There are amazing new applications that are coming online. And I know there are lots of young people here, so you people appreciate this even more than the other individuals. But I also want to talk about the privacy and security challenges that we face in this new digital world, and close by talking about ways people can protect themselves from some of the dangers of the current internet. The internet has been a transformative technology. I would put it in the same category as the printing press, radio, and television in terms of social and political impact. 50 years from now, when people are looking back on our era and wondering, what was different about this era, what was new, what was novel, what did we create, the internet is certainly going to be one of the primary things. It's influential because it reduces communication costs virtually to zero. It overcomes some types of social hierarchies by democratizing information, and it allows new applications and new content providers to flourish. We've made tremendous progress in a variety of different areas. I actually have a book coming out this fall from Brookings Institution Press entitled "The Next Wave: Using Digital Technology to Further Social and Political Innovation." And in that book, I talk about a number of new things that are taking place in a lot of different areas: healthcare, in data storage, in the way government functions, in mass communications, and in digital media, among other topics. And when you think about the role that technology is playing, not just in U.S. Policy, but around the world. You know, we all have seen the role of social media in the political transformations that have taken place in Egypt and Tunisia, where technology helped connect people. It helped people who were unhappy with the then current regime find other like-minded individuals. It allowed them to mobilize, to organize street protests. Eventually, it brought down leaders who had governed those countries for 3 to 4 decades. But of course, you also have to keep in mind the complicated role that technology can play in different countries. We all recall in the middle of those Iranian street protests that people were talking about technology playing a liberating role in Iran. Around that time, I wrote a short paper entitled "The Two Faces of Twitter," because what I was hearing at that time was a bunch of media commentary talking about the democratizing potential of the internet, of social media, of cell phone communications, of Twitter and Facebook, and how this new technology was going to liberate people. What I said in that column, though, was that technology could act as a force for liberation or suppression. And in Iran, it has turned out, at least in the short run, to be the latter. The problem with digital communications is that people leave digital fingerprints all over the place. What the Iranian authorities have discovered is the first thing they do when they identify street protesters or dissidents is they get their laptops, their cell phones, their memory cards, and through those devices, you can basically recreate people's lives almost on a minute-by-minute basis. And so if your intent in a particular country is to oppress people and to prosecute dissenting voices, these digital tools actually make it much easier. And so in some countries, we're seeing technology play a constructive role, helping to liberate people. In other countries, it's having the exact opposite effect. And so it shows how important it is to kind of think about the role that technology is playing in all of this. A little closer to home, we're seeing lots of interesting new applications in terms of various domestic policy initiatives. One of the things I've written about is healthcare. I had a book entitled Digital Medicine that looked at the latest push towards electronic medical records and health information technology. As you know, American healthcare right now is very decentralized. We have 560,000 doctors and 5,800 hospitals in the United States. In that type of organizational fragmentation, it raises the cost and creates lots of service delivery problems and inefficiencies. And so we all know the story of American healthcare being very difficult, high cost, and not always delivering on the things that we want. Now, technology has the potential to make a difference on both sides of that equation. It can help us lower costs by improving connectivity, and it can also enable new applications that improve people's lives. For example, some doctors, and there may be some here in Las Vegas that are offering this, allow you to make online appointments. So it's much easier for the patient to connect with the physician. There's some doctors that now are sending electronic reminders to patients to take medication. Now, this might strike you as very simple, but there have been studies suggesting half of patients don't take their medicine at the required time or at the proper dosage. So a little thing like an email every day from your doctor saying, by the way, don't forget to take your pill, can actually have tremendous impact both on the cost and the quality of healthcare that we receive. Soon, when we get much faster broadband, we are going to be in a position where physicians can email x-rays, CAT scans, or mammograms to other physicians. It will allow patients to get second opinions much easier. And so there are going to be tremendous changes taking place in healthcare that are enabled by a new technology. Technology has the potential to improve public sector performance, and by God, we need a lot of help in that area. We may actually be closing our government this weekend if the negotiations don't go well in the next 24 hours. But there have been lots of new technology applications in many countries around the world. A few years ago, I was part of a technology delegation that visited China. And so our plane landed in Beijing, and we were going through the passport control at the airport. And as I came up to the passport officer, I looked down, and there was an electronic device that allowed me to rate that guy on a 1 to 4 scale based on my satisfaction with how he handled airport security and the processing of my passport. Now, I'm not sure what the endpoints on those scales were. Like 1 might be outstanding performance, 4 could be take this guy out and shoot him. You know, China takes stuff like this very seriously. But, you know, for an authoritarian regime, I thought this was a great example of introducing accountability into the system. You know, this was at a time when China was having a lot of international visitors in the lead up to the Olympics, and they recognized that that passport officer was the first Chinese person that many foreign visitors were going to encounter. They wanted to make sure that person did a good job. So they created a technology mechanism that from their standpoint, help to further good service. Other Asian countries are doing amazing things with technology in the public sector. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan all have been very innovative in the use of smartphones and mobile devices. In many of these large Asian cities, you can track whether the bus that you are planning to take actually is on time at a particular location. You know, we've all had that experience of standing at the bus stop, wondering, you know, when is the bus going to come? And you wait and you look and you keep waiting for it to come. You never know when it's going to come. Well, you know, in some places, you can actually go onto your cell phone and find out instantly how far away that particular bus is from that bus stop. In Tokyo, there are devices where you can find out, obviously Tokyo being a very congested city, where the open parking places are on a particular block. You know, that's a great benefit. You know, I would pay a lot of money for that in major American cities. So there are lots of very popular features that are emerging in a number of other countries. Digital tools have been a little slower to be embraced in the United States and elsewhere in our public sector in particular. But in the long run, technology has the potential to make our government much more proactive. Right now, government is very reactive. Government officials tend to wait for people to request information or services. But the internet is going to allow government agencies to customize information and push it out to people. Let's say you are a soybean farmer in Iowa and you have registered that interest with the Department of Agriculture website. Now, suppose that research comes out of the Iowa State University on soybeans or market conditions or some new research affecting that particular agricultural sector. You know, as opposed to the government agency waiting for that farmer to come in or phone in or email to request information, they know that that person is interested in soybean farming. They can push that information out and say, oh, by the way, there's this new university report on soybeans that you may find useful. That's a very different approach to government services, more proactive and less reactive. So that type of thing, if you accumulate it over a lot of different government agencies, could make a big difference. So in a lot of respects, when you think about what the technology is going to enable just in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see extraordinary benefits and extraordinary gains coming out of these types of new initiatives. But there are warning signs that we need to worry about. Despite the potential positive benefits, we face unprecedented challenges from the internet. Some of the very same things that we like, some of the very same features that we find very desirable, actually pose problematic features for us. Virtually every day when I open up my newspaper, there is some aspect of digital technology that has become controversial. A few months ago in the New York Times, there was a big story about cyberbullying. You know, young kids using the internet and phone text to ridicule and abuse their classmates, and students experiencing great emotional harm from that type of thing. We all recall the example of Wikileaks posting hundreds of thousands of secret U.S. diplomatic cables online for everyone to read. And by the way, you know, one footnote to the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, in part, some of those protests and some of that discontent was fueled by things that either American authorities said about Egypt and or Tunisia, or things Egyptian and Tunisian authorities said to American diplomats that were made public and that enraged local individuals. There have been privacy breaches with American financial institutions, healthcare and educational institutions. New York City recently lost 1.7 million health records. Nobody likes to see their health records put out in that type of manner. So the question is, why are we experiencing all these problems with digital technology? You know, it's the 20th anniversary of the internet. You know, we should be applauding and taking advantage of all the good things. What happened was, in the 1990s, when the internet was developing, the United States made a decision as a government and as a society to have a libertarian view of the internet. By that, I mean we decided to take a hands-off view of the internet. We were going to let it develop however it developed. And by the way, this was a very different approach to any of the past communications revolutions. For example, in the 20th century, when radio came in and then when television came in, our view was that these were both very powerful new types of communications. We didn't quite understand how they were going to be used or what their social or political impact was going to be. So we decided to regulate them, that you had to have a broadcast license to run a TV station. You couldn't just start broadcasting. You had to apply to the federal government, explain what you were doing. You had to promise to serve the public interest. You had to promise to provide community-oriented content on your TV station. In the early days, the first 40 years, you had to promise to be fair. You know, you couldn't be biased or too one-sided in your political coverage. With the internet, we made a very different decision. In 1997, a government official named Ira Magaziner, who some of you may recall as being instrumental in President Clinton's healthcare initiative, after healthcare bit the dust, they were looking for something for Ira to do, and they decided, the internet, it's emerging, it's starting to develop, we don't really understand it, you go study it, and you make some recommendations about what we should do. And so in '97, Ira Magaziner published a document called The Framework for Global Electronic Commerce. And in that document, it proposed a hands-off policy towards the internet based on two key principles. One, the private sector should lead, and two, governments should avoid undue restrictions on electronic commerce. Now, keep in mind, this was the period right after the Republican Revolution in 1994. And so, this was when Bill Clinton had proclaimed the era of big government was over. So the idea that we would regulate the internet through government bureaucracies, it was not the, government officials decided that is not the time to do that. That's not what we want to do. We don't want to follow the radio model. We don't want to do what we did with television. We're going to do the opposite. We're basically going to let the internet develop the way that it did. Now, almost immediately, things started happening that people didn't like. Spam. It took years to develop spam filters. It took years to get laws passed criminalizing the mass emailing to millions of people, all those annoying messages that you get on all sorts of different things. Online pornography, of course, is now the most profitable part of the internet. There are issues of online theft and how it should be handled. If you hack into a financial institution and steal 10,000 credit card numbers, there actually still is ambiguity over whether that is one crime or 10,000 crimes. And that makes a difference in terms of the offenses and the types of penalties that we apply to those particular crimes. So, you know, it really is like the old Willie Sutton line of why he robbed banks. Well, because that's where the money is. Today, criminals are now going after electronic commerce and online shopping because that's where the money is. The more we shop online, the more health information gets stored online, education records are moving online, your personal lives are moving online through Facebook and other social media networks. Well, people who intend to do bad things to you are following your activities and trying to figure out how they can exploit all that information. So what we're doing today is really debating that libertarian principle and trying to figure out where to draw the line between individual freedom on the one hand versus government action. And I should point out that other countries made very different decisions about the internet. For example, European countries have been much more interventionist. You know, they are perfectly willing to regulate the internet in ways that we don't. In America, you want to put up a Nazi website, an anti-black website, an anti-Jew website, an anti-anything website, you can do it. There's really nothing to prevent you from doing it as long as you're not advocating violence or things like that. In France and Germany, they banned Nazi websites. Like, you cannot put up a Nazi website. You can't sell Nazi paraphernalia. And so other countries have made very different decisions on how they are handling the internet. And of course, China is the most obvious example of this in terms of internet censorship. They overtly censor content. When I was in China on the trip I was telling you about before, I tried to access a website called Inside Politics and was denied access, and later learned that most sites in China that feature the word politics are banned. You know, you cannot access that type of content. And so America is now having to confront some of the issues that European countries dealt with in the early days of the internet. Where do we draw the line in terms of how we should think about the internet? And two areas in particular that I want to focus on in terms of this line drawing is, one, the area of privacy, which is very controversial here, and then secondly, the issue of security. And both of them pose major challenges to us. There actually are several pieces of legislation currently pending in Congress right now that address each of them. And so I want to talk about each of them just to kind of lay out both the opportunities that we face, but also the risks that we're confronting, and ultimately what you should do about some of these potential problems. And I want to kind of talk about the privacy issue in the context of Facebook, you know, one of our countries as well as the world's favorite sites. Personally, I love Facebook. I have 2,300 friends. I would welcome friendship requests from any of you as well, by the way. But think about what we have given Facebook. We have given them a goldmine of marketing information. Most people, when they create a Facebook account, they give Facebook their name, their email address, their phone number, their educational background, their political views, their religious affiliations, lists of books and movies that they like, and commentary that they and the person's friends post regularly on that site. Think about this not from a social networking standpoint, which is a standpoint Facebook wants you to think about it from a business marketing standpoint. Because when you have that kind of information on 600 million individuals, you can start to think about pretty amazing mass marketing campaigns tailored to people's specific interests. You know, in the last couple of decades, we have gone from advertising based on a broadcasting model, you know, the television model, you know, you kind of run an ad and kind of blast it out to a huge number of people. And then cable TV came in, the audiences got smaller, so we kind of moved from broadcasting to narrowcasting, so you could target on more specific audiences. Now with the internet, with Facebook, and with these other tools, we have moved into microcasting. You can target ads on very discrete types of individuals with much greater precision than we have ever had before. You know, this is the reason Facebook has an estimated valuation of $50 billion. It is not the social networking aspect of that that makes it that valuable. It is the marketing information that is represented there. And I should point out this is not a privacy issue in the conventional sense, because every single one of you who has a Facebook account voluntarily turns over this information to Facebook and basically gives Facebook the control over your intellectual property. It's not that Facebook stole that information. If they did that, you could sue them for invasion of privacy and doing bad things with your information. You give them that information, but then people turn around and complain about Facebook using the information or other companies advertising based on that. And so our whole notion of privacy is getting turned on its head because you voluntarily are turning over confidential information. And so we're arguing over, well, okay, we admit we gave it to them, but that doesn't mean we are going to allow them to use it however they want. You know, we still want to have a say. And so a lot of the debates over privacy, or particularly with Facebook, involves the question of, you know, can or should Facebook allow commercial companies access to your information in order to send you ads? Now, the Federal Trade Commission has proposed a do not track law similar to a do not call list that you can sign up for, that you can say, hey, I don't want ads, and that if that were implemented, which it currently is not, then that would stop companies, at least theoretically, from doing that. There also is the question of what is the default on commercial marketing campaigns? Like, can companies market unless you explicitly say no? Or do you have to agree in advance to say yes before a company can send you ads? That's basically the difference between the current Facebook preference as a company, which is the opt-out approach, which is you say you don't want it, and then they won't send you ads. Others basically say that's not a strong enough guarantee for consumers. We need an opt-in strategy where they can't market to you unless you explicitly say they can market to you. And so basically, through these and other types of policy discussions, we're negotiating access and control over online information. We are basically starting to redraw that libertarian principle of, well, whatever happens is going to happen, we're not going to let the government decide, to starting to think about either company self-regulation or perhaps even Congress passing laws to basically make these decisions. Now, what makes the privacy debate very complicated is not just the legal issues involved here and differing conceptions of privacy, which in and of themselves are very complicated, but we are allocating economic opportunities across a wide variety of companies and a wide variety of economic sectors. There are big and small corporate interests on all sides of those privacy questions. You know, Microsoft, Google, AT&T, and all the small and medium-sized companies that now play in the internet world. Basically, everybody has a stake in that. And so by the decisions that we make on do not track, opt-in versus opt-out, we're allocating certain advantages by either making it easier for a Facebook and affiliated companies to market to you and therefore monetize your private interest, or we're making it more difficult. There are fights between the big telecoms and everybody else over these issues. There are fights between Microsoft versus Google. I mean, you can kind of look at these economic sectors and, man, it is war out there among these companies. And so, you know, everybody seems to want Congress to do something to protect consumer privacy. But right now, Congress is paralyzed by the legal issues, the policy issues, and the economic issues involved in sorting out these types of things. Now, this whole privacy area and the advertising area is going to get even more complicated because companies are now developing even more extraordinary targeting capabilities than what I've talked about to date. The two new trends that are developing are, one, behavioral advertising, and two, geolocation advertising. And let me just kind of briefly explain each of them. Behavioral advertising is basically, when you go online, there are cookies that can basically track what you do online, what types of sites you visit, and they can then target ads based on that information. The whole term behavioral advertising means they can follow your behavior and then advertise to you based on that. For example, they may notice that occasionally I go to sites that sell chocolate. And so, you know, one day I'm going to start getting a bunch of chocolate ads based on that. And we're going to see that across every a business sector, because the capability is here. It's not a technology question. It's a question of, do companies want to do this, and when do they want to start doing it? Ditto with geolocation advertising. You know, almost every smartphone now has a GPS device built into it, global positioning system, that can add a geographic component to advertising. You know, let's say you're walking down the street and you want a restaurant recommendation. Now, rather than just give you a generic list of all the restaurants in Las Vegas, you know, they can see that I am near Tropicana Avenue, and they can give me restaurant recommendations within 1, 2, or 3 blocks of my current location. And so they can not only target ads based on your behavior and your preferences, but on your location. When you combine the digital world, behavioral advertising, and geolocation advertising, it is going to create enormous issues in terms of whether, how, and under what conditions we should basically run our lives. And you can see some obvious pluses for consumers, in the sense that one of the worst things about advertising today is not that you're getting ads, but you're getting irrelevant ads. You know, you're getting flooded by things in which you have no interest. Through some of these techniques, the ads becoming more targeted may actually be a benefit to consumers, in the sense that it will weed out some of the garbage and kind of focus on areas of at least potential interest for you. But yet, on the other hand, these highly targeted ads are highly intrusive. You know, they know a lot about you. They know a lot about what you're interested in. They know a lot about your behavior. They know where you're going and when you're doing various things. You know, how do you feel about that? And then they're monetizing that information through advertising. So all of this stuff is going to be very interesting and very complicated to sort out. And so, you know, we have the question of, are we just going to follow the consenting adults model and kind of let it work itself out somehow? Or is there going to be legislation that lays out what companies can do? Right now, much of the privacy legislation that governs this area dates back to 1986, when Congress passed the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Now think what the world was like in 1986. There was no internet, there was no Google, Facebook, Twitter, Groupon, or a range of other companies. Many of the companies that probably many of you use on a regular basis did not exist at the time Congress passed the last major privacy legislation. And so what's happening now, with Congress being unable to pass legislation in this area, it doesn't mean that the government is not making rules to govern this area. Instead, what is happening is, instead of having a national debate, having members of Congress decide, passing a law, and those become the rules, what's happening now is our policy is being determined through the judiciary. Essentially, as companies do certain things, somebody gets upset, they file a lawsuit, some judge makes a decision, it goes up through the system. And so we're making government decisions on a very decentralized and fragmented basis, and Nevada may end up with a different set of rules in the short run compared to New England or Miami or California. And maybe that's good. I mean, that historically is how Americans have handled complex political issues, using federalism, and let different jurisdictions make different policies depending on how judges in those areas interpret the rules. Now, in 10 years, those legal inconsistencies are going to get resolved, because the cases are going to go through the system, they'll go up through the appellate court, some of the more prominent cases will end up in the Supreme Court, there will be decisions made, then we will have rules, then there will be more predictability. But right now, we're in a very difficult situation because basically we don't really have rules. And so companies don't know what their liability is for doing different things, consumers don't know what their rights are. There may be one set of rules in one part of the country and a very different set of rules elsewhere. So those are the types of privacy complications that we are grappling with. In the security area, there are equally pronounced challenges. One of the favorite ones I like to talk about is there's a free software called Firesheep that anyone can download off of the internet. Basically, there was a guy who was upset with Facebook and what this individual viewed as Facebook's lax approach to privacy and security. And so basically, to prove how insecure Facebook and use of the internet was, he basically created this software program called Firesheep, which allows you, if you have that software on your computer, to eavesdrop on anybody else using an insecure connection to access the internet. So for example, you go to Starbucks or any other coffee shop and there's a free wireless network there, you log on to it. In a lot of those places, those are insecure networks. They are not encrypted, and basically through Firesheep, somebody can basically sit right next to you in that Starbucks coffee shop, and with a couple of clicks of the mouse, they can basically get onto your Facebook account that you are also accessing on that site and pretend to be you. They can be you. They can send email messages to your friends. They can send embarrassing pictures of yourself to your friends. They can do whatever you could do with your account because they have access to your account. There's a guy who actually did an experiment on this in Seattle where he literally used a Firesheep to go into a Starbucks coffee shop, and he logged on, and there were like 10 or 12 people in the coffee shop at that time accessing the internet through insecure connections, and he could basically see everything they were doing on their screen. He could do commands on their sites, and so he would email them and say, by the way, like, are you aware you're accessing Facebook over an insecure network, and I can actually see everything on your page? And the people not only did not respond to him, they just pretended like this was a joke, it didn't exist. They just kept accessing Facebook or their bank account or whatever else they were doing as if there were no problem. And so people's awareness of the security threats is very low in this country. And by the way, over 1 million people have downloaded Firesheep and are using it to snoop on other people. Now, so basically, what I'm in closing, there are many great benefits of the internet, and we're going to see them in a wide variety of areas, in social movements, in healthcare, in education, in mass communications, even in terms of public sector innovation, but there are clear privacy and security risks. We still are trying to work out how to resolve those issues. So how can you protect yourself? As consumers, I think there are several things that you can do to help yourself as we tame what now is the Wild West of the internet. The best protection is to use non-obvious passwords and to have different passwords for various accounts. Using your partner's name, that of your pet, or your hometown, or your favorite sports team is asking for trouble, because those of you who have Facebook accounts, which is probably most of the people in this room, you've already publicly disclosed all that information on your site. Criminals know that, and so it is so easy to break into people's account using your own password because you choose stupid passwords. I'm not trying to insult you personally, excuse me for that. That was just kind of a collective comment there. So we all need to be better about password accounts. Secondly, you should read the online privacy policy of various sites to discover whether and how that website is going to employ the information that you are voluntarily giving it. These policies detail the use of cookies for tracking visitors, what the company does with your information, whether the company sells information to other vendors. There's all sorts of interesting information in there. If you don't see a strong policy there protecting consumer interests, you should not trust that site. Because if they don't explicitly tell you they're going to safeguard your information, they're not going to do it. And they have no legal responsibility to do it. That's the whole point of a privacy policy, to alert you to how they are going to use your information. And by the way, almost nobody looks at privacy policies. You should upgrade to the most recent version of whatever internet browser you are using, because the older versions have well-known security flaws that are very easy to exploit, and it exposes you to a great danger. You know, one of the most important security measures which we could do, which we will never do, is basically kind of get rid of the old versions of all of the internet browsers, because they are sieves of information that are very easy to hack. The more recent versions of these browsers are much more security conscious, there's much better protection, but there are huge numbers of Americans that still have not upgraded, that still use the old versions, and therefore expose themselves and other people to a great risk. Lazy consumers make easy targets for criminals. Legislators should update our rules in these areas because most of the current laws were written well before the internet, social media, and other new digital platforms. It's very hard for law enforcement to police the digital world when our major legislation was written decades ago. It's hard to prosecute crimes when those crimes were not even envisioned in some of the major laws that exist today. We need stiffer penalties for cybercrime. It's amazing how much damage criminals can do and still either not get jail time or get a minimal jail time. You know, if somebody kind of did the same thing in a physical sense, meaning in a person-to-person manner, you know, we would throw the book at that individual. But if you do it digitally, the penalties are not nearly as severe. Then the last point I want to make, and then I will shut up and open the floor to any questions or comments that you have, is the greatest risk in the internet actually is not the technology, it's the human element. The biggest problems on the internet in terms of the loss of confidentiality and the loss of security are disgruntled employees stealing information or lost or stolen laptops and smartphones. There are something like 600,000 laptops and 700,000 smartphones that are lost or stolen each year. A number of these have very sensitive personal or corporate information on them. And keep in mind, we're all conducting much more of our personal and business lives online. We're doing more transactions online. We're increasingly relying on mobile devices to do those things. The most common places where these items are lost or stolen are hotels, airports, and cars. So when you're going through airport security, be sure to remember your keys, your laptop, and your smartphone, because you would not believe the number of laptops and smartphones that get left behind at airport security. So in the long run, I am actually quite optimistic that technology will help to improve many areas of human existence, but we should keep in mind we're still very early in the digital revolution. We're at the 20-year mark. It took telephones nearly 50 years to diffuse among the population so that it became a common feature of people's communications. We're going to see tremendous progress over the next 5 to 10 years, but we have a lot of legal and policy issues to work out. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions and comments that you have. Thank you. Thank you. Right here, we have a question?
Yeah, you clearly defined privacy issues, and you touched on the economic issues. Companies like Groupon, like Facebook, people are opting into those. There are disclosures on that. And with greater regulation, what would happen to the valuation of those companies and the jobs that it's created?
It would cut the valuation. Like if Congress passed a very tough pro-consumer and privacy protection law, that would have implications for the value of Facebook, Groupon, and all those other companies. And that's one of the things that makes it difficult for Congress to act. Where Congress has the biggest problem, you know, we often think it's ideological debates, and you know, that obviously is a big part. But when you have lots of economic interest on different sides of major issues because their business business interest is affected by that policy, that creates enormous difficulty for our elected officials to deal with. But you're exactly right. If we pass tough security laws, tough privacy laws, if we kind of opt in versus opt out, it has big consequences for these companies and their valuations.
Well, the people that use it would have to pay for the service instead of getting it for free. I mean, that's one of the things that did form how the market has gone.
That was our Faustian bargain with many of these digital companies. They gave us stuff for free, we gave them information. Now, it's like we're not sure whether we like how they're using all the information, but the question is, you know, do we want to renegotiate that agreement? Other questions and comments? Yep.
With the recent loss of email data by a clearinghouse, where you give your email address to Best Buy thinking it's Best Buy that has it, yet it goes to this clearinghouse that sends out mass mailings. What kind of liability does that clearinghouse have for the loss of your data?
In many cases, they don't have very much liability because one of the complicated things about electronic commerce is there are a number of intermediate connections across the system. Like when you shop at Amazon or Best Buy or wherever, we kind of think this is a one-to-one relationship. You're the consumer, you go in, the business gives you the product. But through electronic commerce, there are all these intermediaries, many of which you don't even know about, that have pieces of the information trail. So let's say there's a data breach, you're a consumer, you can prove harm, you want to sue someone. Well, it gets pretty complicated. And in some of the licensing agreements that these companies have developed, they basically have embedded in those contracts the fact they do not have legal liability on the information. Consumers don't know that. And so, you know, we're starting to discover this as the lawsuits are taking place. People are starting to sue companies, and then they discover the contract basically protects that company from particular types of damages. So we need to do a lot more consumer education in that area in particular. Yes, over here.
Could you possibly comment on the recent Wikileaks events and how you see that playing out?
I'd love to, especially since that was in the title of my talk. I'm glad you asked that question. My view on WikiLeaks is these people are a bunch of anarchists, and they're very dangerous for the world, not just the United States. The WikiLeaks people like to present themselves to the world as Democrats in the small d sense of the term, meaning they're promoting transparency, accountability. They're in favor of opening up information. They don't like secret government cables, keeping information on Iraq and Afghanistan from Americans and other people around the world. But I don't really buy that self-justification. I label them anarchists because these are people who basically want to tear down authorities, not just American authorities, but they have compromised virtually every country around the world by disclosing confidential things that were said in what the people assumed was going to be a private setting. And it's not just a public sector thing. You know, everybody keeps talking about, hey, they have information on Bank of America. At some point, they're going to do a data dump there. You know, they could, and we should keep in mind the WikiLeaks leak actually was not a technology problem. It was a political decision within the military to essentially decentralize information so that low-level military people had access to very secret information. And there was this guy who basically, you know, did a data dump of hundreds of thousands of documents. So it was kind of the classic human error vulnerability in the technology system. Any company, any organization, the Catholic Church, the Boy Scouts, I mean, everybody is vulnerable to that type of thing because it only takes one disgruntled employee in any organization to do to that organization what WikiLeaks did to the US State Department. So therefore, I think that makes it dangerous. Other questions?
So, back when you were talking about Facebook and their data aggregation, I don't know if you heard of this company called ChoicePoint in Georgia. They're an aggregator of private and public databases in the United States.
It's a great business niche.
Yeah, so in 2005, they had 10,000 clients, 7,000 of which were government agencies like local, state, and federal law enforcement. Now, if you know, the government is the you know, their biggest customer, what motivation do they have to stop companies from collecting data on people such as Facebook and, you know, having an opt-in?
There are a lot of both private and public sector organizations that have an interest in invading people's privacy. But what's different about our current era is the ease with which one can do that. And the data aggregation issue is a perfect example of that because, you know, today it's very easy to have databases, say from one company that let's say it has like 4 bits of discrete information about you, but one of them happens to be your social security number. And then there's this other organization, they have 4 other discrete bits of information about you, one of which also happens to be your social security number. Now through database management, you can basically merge those databases through the common identifier and build big databases on each individual. And obviously that's beneficial in the private sector because companies want information so they can market more effectively. It's valuable for law enforcement officials in government because they can use that to track bad people. And it's one of those questions, again, we're having to grapple with in the technology area. Where are we going to draw the line between governments have a legitimate interest in law enforcement, consumers have an interest in privacy? How are we going to reconcile those things? And right now, given the fact that Congress has not acted, we haven't reconciled that. We haven't had a national debate. People don't even understand what the issues are. They don't understand the benefits or the risks that are posed by these types of things. I think you had a question as well?
I said over here.
Oh, okay. Someone over here? Yeah.
Thank you for coming, appreciate it. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'll try and come back before the next 33 years.
Privacy and security, the central themes of your topic. Just a general comment, I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on it. It seems like local authorities, say just your local police authorities, not too much higher than that, but the ones that are really working with the public, they seem to be interested in keeping your physical possessions secure. Like they'll tell you how to keep your laptop and your cell phone secure, like you had mentioned earlier. But once it gets to the next level as far as communication and then the data that's on those machines, there's very little outreach by the law enforcement for, say, encryption or how to keep that secure. So once it gets beyond the physical into the, I don't know, you say soft data, there seems to be very little action going towards that.
That's exactly right. And that's the reason we need consumer education, so that at least people understand what is going on and what the potential risks are to themselves out of that type of system. But right now, people don't really understand that as we move from the physical or the personal world to the digital world, the rules are different. We kind of imagine that we have the same rules across every platform of existence, and it's simply not the case. For example, courts already have ruled that there are different rules on privacy for you storing information on your personal computer because it is in your personal possession, as opposed to you storing information on a cloud platform, a data storage platform. And the legal rationale is you have less of a right to privacy under cloud computing because you have voluntarily transferred your information to a third party. And so therefore, that waters down your privacy protection. But most people, when they're using computers now, they may not even know if something they're accessing is on their desktop or is on Facebook or a cloud site or Amazon or some other site they're accessing. They're going back and forth between personal and third-party sites all the time. They don't understand their privacy rights differ across those platforms. So those are the types of things we need to do a much better job of informing people about what's going on. Yes, sir.
So growing up with the internet, it's always been an arena for me where you could access information that you wouldn't necessarily be able to access, say, watching TV or the radio or even school. So because of that, I sort of see it as an extension of like a First Amendment right, like a freedom of speech. So in talking about regulating it and not being able to, I know it's an extreme example, but go on a website that talks about politics, that really concerns me. So my question to you is, how do we regulate the internet for an American audience?
That's a great question, but with the freedom of speech example, even there, we don't have an unlimited right to freedom of speech. Right. There have been lots of legal rulings that under certain conditions, it's perfectly appropriate to limit freedom of speech. And what we're trying to work out in the digital world is what are the equivalents of that? Like we're basically going to protect freedom of speech in the digital world because that right is in the Bill of Rights. But is it an unlimited right? Well, that's not going to be the case because that's not the experience in American history. But we haven't figured out what are the cases that are going to impose the limits. The way we found out what the limits were on freedom of speech in personal terms was through court rulings, that particular things happened, somebody sued, and the court said, wait a minute, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And so therefore we knew there were limits. That is how we're going to figure out what the limits are on freedom of speech in the digital world. And we don't know that yet. Yes, sir.
Are you comfortable talking about what's going on with ICANN and control of the internet?
Sure. What's the issue that you'd like to have addressed?
It seems to be a tension as to whether or not the United States continues to manage it. The other countries don't want to. Current thinking in Washington on that?
For those of you who are not up on this, ICANN is basically a nonprofit organization that registers the domain names. So let's say you're creating a website, you access ICANN to basically get that domain name registration. So they're the organization that handles that. That has basically been an American operation. The internet has basically been an American thing. Even though Tim Berners-Lee actually was of Swiss ancestry, he came to the United States. ARPANET was American. Tim Berners-Lee was in America when he actually put the internet together. So because that was the case, we have kind of controlled it. And it's kind of a reflection of the changing status of the United States in world affairs that other countries around the world are saying, wait a minute, why do you people get to control the internet? Why is English becoming the de facto language of the internet? Soon, probably within 10 years, there are going to be more internet users who access the internet using Chinese than English, if you combine the United Kingdom, America, Canada, and so on. So, why shouldn't China be running the internet in the future? It's kind of a question of international diplomacy, who controls the internet, who registers the domain names. And it's one of those arcane questions that, when you start talking about it, people's eyes glaze over, but it actually has a lot of political and economic importance for the United States and other countries. Who controls the internet? Because right now, the internet is the dominant tool of electronic commerce, and clearly it's going to grow more important in the future. And whoever controls it writes rules favorable to their particular interests. And we have done that. Other countries are growing resentful of that. And so there's kind of a movement around the world to have a more egalitarian governance structure for that organization. So it's really not an American enterprise. And it's one of, it's a question of American foreign policy that doesn't get hardly any attention because, we have 3 wars and Iran and North Korea and a bunch of other things going on. But, in terms of future economic impact, this is actually an important thing and deserves a lot more attention than what it currently gets. I think we are about out of time, but I want to thank all of you for coming out and asking great questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.